Okay, I used to be successful, and now I'm not. So I feel absolutely shattered. I'm 28 years old, and it's like my career peaked 5 years ago. From ages of 23 to 25, I got articles published in the Wall Street Journal, the Huffington Post, and Los Angeles Times, signed a book deal, and had a job writing a politics newsletter for 30,000 subscribers working 3 blocks from the White House. Now I struggle to make $20K a year and can't find anyone willing to hire me. The company I worked for went under in 2017, and we were all laid off. I took some remote writing jobs, but they weren't a fit. Experimented with being a professional poker player for a while, and now here I am trying to get back into the job market and can't seem to break through. I submit job applications like it's a full-time job. I've gotten a few interviews and really close to certain positions, but they always seem to pick a different candidate at the final round. My self-esteem is rapidly diminishing. I used to feel like I was unique and had a lot to offer. My whole life, people told me I had all these talents and gifts, sounding familiar, chat, but I'm left feeling entirely unwanted by the professional world. I'm starting to seriously question if it was all a lie. If I'm so special, why can't I even get an email back? Emails, emails, emails. All I do is send emails. I'm getting cynical and sad. Starting to feel like the job market is a gamified scam like dating apps, promising connections but mostly resulting in poor, superficial matches, and the only ones that work out are dumb luck. I'm actually married now, but all these job rejections remind me of the misery and rejections of dating apps I used to experience. One of us has got to be in the wrong here. Either A, the job market can't seem to recognize me as a motivated, intelligent candidate, or B, I'm not nearly as special or accomplished as I thought I was, and this rejection is completely deserved. Professionally speaking, I am worthless. So I don't know if this is option B or this is a conclusion. So this is unfortunately something that actually happens a lot to people. So we've talked about gifted kids, right? So we've talked about people who are told from a young age that they're gifted and talented. And oftentimes what we find is that gifted kids run into a wall. And when they run into a wall, they really start to struggle because their whole sense of identity is built off of being gifted. And how do people tell them that they're gifted? Why do people tell them that they're gifted? Well, that's because, it's usually due to performance. So like when I write, the best essay in the class in the 7th grade, someone tells me, wow, you are a really talented writer. And so I think, oh, okay, so like my value as a human being is because I'm gifted, and I'm gifted because I'm a talented writer. And then that kind of perpetuates, right? In 9th grade, I write another really good essay as well. I'm gifted, I'm gifted, I'm gifted. And then even sometimes with gifted kids, they start to flounder a little bit in let's say, high school because they haven't developed study habits because they are actually like very talented or very intelligent or something like that. So you don't develop the supporting skills, which means that at some point you like hit a wall because either you can jump right over it or you kind of run into it because you never learned how to climb, right? So it's either like a full clear or like a full stop. And so that's where sometimes like we run into problems in high school. That's where I started to have problems. I certainly had problems in college and had to like learn how to study and apply myself. And then we also see this kind of situation where people, do really good and then they may go to college and do well in college. And then they like in their first phase of their professional career, they get like a lot of really prestigious things, right? So Wall Street Journal, Huffington Post, LA Times, signed a book deal, working 3 blocks from the White House. And so then sometimes what happens is that these people too, so now like you sort of get that you're gifted, right? Look at the world, look at the accolades that I have. That's how I know that I have value. And then if something goes wrong, like, if the company goes under in 2017, and then what happens is like, since your sense of identity is built up through being gifted, talented, and your accolades, the moment your accolades go away, the moment your accomplishments go away, your self-esteem goes with it. So this, unfortunately, is a all too common experience, and it absolutely sucks to go through. And the good news is that, like, just because you have been successful in the past and are now hitting a wall does not mean that you don't have value, does not mean that you aren't brilliant. The reason that we feel this way is because our determination of our brilliance is based on external factors, right? So like our sense of our value as a human being is based on the kind of rewards that the world gives us. And so if you're in this kind of situation, this is actually a really, really good opportunity to like grow as a person and really start to figure out like who you are and what you can be proud of that is independent of what the rest of the world appreciates. So what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about this situation and sort of like go into more detail, okay? So the first thing that we're going to do is talk a little bit about the psychology of like what's going on with self-esteem, right? So I sort of explained some of it now. So we're going to talk a little bit about like how do we build ourselves up? Where does self-esteem come from? How is it reinforced? And then sometimes if our karma, if our circumstances change, how that can pull the rug out from under our self-esteem. And then if that situation happens where things aren't hunky-dory, everything isn't fantastic now, how can you start to go about the process of like getting your self-esteem back? And how can you start the process of exploring where self-esteem truly comes from? Because self-esteem does not come from the Washington Post, does not come from the LA Times, does not come from working 3 blocks from the White House. Self-esteem comes from the self. The problem is that this person does not have self-esteem, they have esteem. They have external esteem, right? So how do we start to work on our self-esteem? The last thing that I'd like to talk a little bit about, and this is something that our community has been increasingly both asking for and also appreciating, is some practical tips, right? So if we look at this post for a moment, there's a lot of like really practical stuff here. So like emails. So either the job market can't seem to recognize me as a motivated, intelligent candidate, or I'm not as accomplished or special as I thought. So like we're going to talk actually a little bit about practicalities of like what does the job market actually look for, right? And if you are someone who is talented and has a real contribution to make, does the job market actually care about that? Like when you're sending out thousands of emails to companies that are getting thousands of applications, do they really care about whether you're talented, gifted, brilliant? Are they even giving you a fair shake on that? And what do employers actually look for? Like what's the purpose of a job application? And so I'd like to end with a couple of almost practical tips, right? So how can you kind of start with psychology and then like apply that to the practical steps that you're going to take going forward? Okay, so let's get started. So does that sound good? Okay. So we're going to start with sort of like the psychology of esteem. Okay, so let's go here. So let's talk about the psychology of esteem. So we kind of went through this a little bit, kind of sort of a spoiler alert, but here's the first thing to understand. So our sense of self-worth comes from 2 places. It can come from the outside or from the inside. And the interesting thing is if you look at things like attachment theory, the really interesting thing is that originally when we're very young, our internal sense of self-worth actually comes from the outside. And this is like when we're super young, like, you know, because a child doesn't really know what is an accomplishment and what is not an accomplishment. So the way that we're treated, the way that we're valued will sort of determine our sense of esteem. So for example, some children are given conditional love. So what this sort of means is like the love and support and reinforcement that I get actually has to do with like my performance, right? So if I perform, I'm loved and I'm valued and I'm respected. And some kids are given unconditional love. And this is where like we can still appreciate performance, but the value that you bring as a human being is actually transcendent beyond your performance. So I'll give you all just we have transcendent value. So I'll give you all just a simple example, right? So, oh, you did such a great job. I'm so proud of you. That's awesome. I love it when you get A's. You're the smartest kid in the class. You're so gifted. You're so awesome. So your value is based on getting an A, being gifted, being talented, etc. So we see this a lot with gifted kids. The next thing, like, let's kind of use a different example of unconditional love, right? Which is like, let's say I get a B. So in the case of a gifted kid, like, why didn't you get an A? You need to study harder. You need to work harder. You need to stop playing video games. It's important to get an A, get an A, get an A, get an A. Whereas if we have sort of a situation where we have unconditional love, it's like, it's okay to make mistakes and we care about you anyway, right? So it's sort of like saying, like, your value as a human being doesn't matter. Like, whether you get an A or a B, I love you either way. I really hope that you can study a little bit harder. I'm going to try to help you, right? It's not just your fault that you got a B. As a parent, I recognize that, like, if there's something that you're not able to do, maybe I have a hand in that. And so I sort of, because here's the thing, when it comes to gifted kids in conditional love, the success or failure is all theirs, right? They own it all. It's your responsibility. There's a lot of self-reliance on improvement. So if it's a success, it's your success, but if it's a failure, it's your failure. Whereas in the cases of unconditional love, hopefully you'll have parents who will sort of share responsibility with you, right? Hey, it's not all your fault. It's not like you're an idiot because you got a B. Maybe I need to be doing better as a parent. Maybe I need to make sure that you're doing your homework. Maybe I need to teach you something. Maybe I need to talk to you about why school is hard. And when you say all of those things to a child, what the child sort of recognizes is that the problem is not just here, right? There are all kinds of these things like study habits, parental support. And the more that parents sort of acknowledge that this is responsible for outcomes, the easier it is to be assured of who you are on the inside, right? This is a problem that can be fixed. It's not intrinsic value based on, like, whether you got an A or a B. So this is how things start. So we'll sort of, some people will be raised this way. Some people will be raised predominantly this way. It's like oftentimes both, right? But there's it tends to be a mix of it. And then when we sort of end up with conditional love, and by the way, there's a whole video about that in Dr. K's guide if y'all are interested, the problem of conditional love. Then what happens is that we tend to be a little bit performance oriented, right? So we can work hard, we can be motivated, right? Because my value as a human being depends on my performance. So in order to feel good, I need to get an A, right? So when we sort of, so people will be very, very motivated. They'll actually be very successful in the case of conditional love. Because, like, just think about it for a second. In the case of conditional love, whether you get love or not is conditional. And do you want love? Do you need love? Is it a basic human need? Absolutely. So I'm going to try my level best to meet those requirements, right? So these people tend to be very performance oriented, and then, like, this can escalate. So it starts with A's, and then it's Wall Street Journal, then it's book deal, right? So each of these things that happen, and we can even look at this post. When this person talks about, their value as a human being, they don't say, I wrote some really brilliant articles. They don't say, I wrote some stuff that is like beautiful prose. I did some awesome investigative journalism. I did some amazing political analysis, right? So they don't actually talk about the value of their work. Do y'all see that? What they talk about is the accolades of their work. So there's no intrinsic value. It's about how the value was received. And once you do that, then suddenly this is not about what you wrote, right? It's how the world received what you wrote. So then what happens is your esteem is based on external factors. And so what does that mean for us, right? That means that if the world stops loving us, or we stop getting like positive reinforcement from the world, our esteem is going to go from it because our esteem is not internal. It's not self-esteem, it's external esteem. Right? So like I'll give you all just a quick example. So let's say that, a lot of people are concerned about the way they look and how comfortable they are in their body. So, and a lot of that is determined, it's not actually like how comfortable you are in your body and how okay you are with your appearance. People may assume for a moment that that comfort depends on how people treat you. So if people call you beautiful, like surely that person will be more confident. The truth of the matter is that that's not actually the case, right? That you can have beautiful people who are comfortable in their body And you can have beautiful people who are insecure about their looks. And the insecure people require external validation, right? So some like models, for example, male or female or non-binary or whatever, like they will require constant validation from partners, friends, whatever, about how amazing they look. And the reason that they do that is because their sense of like pride in their appearance actually comes from the external world. Because you'll have some people who are pretty average looking who are actually like pretty content with the way they look, right? They don't actually need external validation to make them comfortable in their own skin. They recognize I'm not the most beautiful person on the planet. I'm not the ugliest person on the planet. I do what I can. You know, I get my hair done well. I try to exercise. I try to, you know, buy clothing that's flattering. Like I'm going to like groom myself properly. And like, I'm never going to be a supermodel, and that's okay. Right? So confidence is not actually about the way the world treats you. And the problem is that if you're someone who is grown up gifted, if you're someone who has performed, and then the world stops giving you validation, then there's a crisis of confidence. And that crisis of confidence is characterized by a loss of self-esteem. But once again, it's not self-esteem, right? It's a loss of esteem. And this is where, you know, the real antidote is to start to develop self-esteem. And we'll get to the how in a second. I recognize it's not just develop self-esteem, chat. So, and here's the thing that I want to point out is that this person, why doesn't this person have self-esteem? It's because they've never needed it, right? So like our body doesn't, you know, my biceps aren't just like ripped because I'm sitting around clicking the mouse. My biceps grow when I like exercise with them, right? So when I lift against a resistance, my body adapts by growing the muscle. And our esteem is the same way. So as long as you've gotten like a lot of esteem from the external world, you will never need to have developed self-esteem, right? And so like this isn't an issue of like you're a bad person or you're a good person or you're, you know, professionally worthless. Like that's not what it's about. It's just simply that thus far in your life, you haven't really needed to develop self-esteem because you've gotten plenty of esteem from the outside world. So your brain and your body are very, very economical. So they're not going to like waste time developing things that are unused, right? So you think about a child who's learning a language. Like learning your first language is incredibly critical because you need to be able to communicate. But once you like learn a language, it's not like your brain is struggling to learn a second language, right? It's because now your needs are met. And if your needs are met, there's no point in changing anything. So then the question becomes, you know, how do I start to develop self-esteem? And so this is where I want to point out like a couple of things that you can sort of do. The first is to, you know, track back to where does your esteem truly come from? And so what I would ask this person is like, when you were riding high, what were you proud of? How did you know that you were doing a good job? And I know it sounds kind of weird, but even that exploration, that acknowledgement of like, what made you proud? What made you know that you could bring value to the world? Was it what you wrote or the fact that you were writing for the Wall Street Journal? Right? And the more that you sort of start to ask, you know, like, where did I derive value? Because here's the key thing. So at the age of 23 to 25, Wall Street Journal, White House, LA Times, right? And then let's say 26 to 28, I think they are now, right? How old are they? 28, yeah. Okay. So from 26 to 28, none of those things. So here's the thing. If you want to build self-esteem here, let's say that your goal is to build self-esteem going forward. This is actually not the right place to start because the lack of self-esteem actually started here, right? This is where you determined what your esteem was based on. So a lot of people will say like, okay, in the present, right? So we advocate for doing stuff in the present, like we teach meditation and stuff. So you can do all that stuff by all means. We've gone into ahamkar and identity and like how to discover who you truly are and stuff like that. But I think the other thing, so we're going to add on to that today. The other thing is that you have to go back to the past and try to figure out like, where did I build my self-esteem? Because oddly enough, what you need to do is deconstruct your esteem from here. right? Because as long as your esteem is determined by external things, like there's not space for you to develop self-esteem. So oftentimes when I work with people, and I saw this a lot, you know, at different institutions that are like very, very high performing, right? So like investment banks, private equity firms, like places like Goldman Sachs and stuff like that. I'd have clients from those kinds of places. And what I sort of discover is that the way that, and they would be like 30, let's say, and they're coming in and they have a crisis of confidence because they just got fired for the first time in their life. And they went to Yale, and then they got an MBA from Yale, and then they went to, you know, Wharton for some other thing. And then like, so it's just like success through and through. And then at 30, they get fired for the first time, or they get a bad performance review, or they don't get promoted. And then they're like spinning in the wind. And the solution is to actually go back and actually deconstruct where your esteem originally came from, right? And this is where you want to ask yourself, like, you know, where does my value come from here? And hopefully what you can discover is that it's not the LA Times that made you good, right? The LA Times may be a seal of approval, absolutely, but that's all it is, right? It's not the real value. The real value is in what you wrote. So like the reason that the LA Times is publishing your stuff, it's not the LA Times that makes you good. It's because you are good that the LA Times will publish your stuff. It's not, the accolades are not the reason you are good. They're a consequence of you are good. So this is where we're going to talk for a second about karma or karma, right? So what comes first? The LA Times into the good writing, or the good writing into the LA Times? And this comes first. So what part are you responsible for? You're responsible for this, right? So absolutely, like once you start writing for the LA Times, maybe you get better and you have good editors and stuff like that and you improve. So there's like some amount of reciprocal stuff, right? But like the reason that you made it there is because you were writing really well. Like you know, and sure, there's like a stepwise kind of thing where you did good in English class, right? English honors, and then journalism at Columbia. And then you wrote your first piece for the HuffPo. And then you wrote your next piece for the New York Times, and you improved over time, like absolutely, right? And did the New York Times look at your writing because you had written for HuffPo? Sure. But here's the thing, they may have looked at it, but the writing had to be good. Like the New York Times is not going to publish you just because you wrote for HuffPo. The reason that the New York Times is going to publish you is because like you wrote something good. And so the truth is, the more that you tunnel down into how the world gives you accolades, the more hopefully you come to the conclusion, this is where I really encourage you to think about it. Are you actually a good writer? Even if you come to the answer no, what I'll oftentimes see with people that I've worked with is, okay, let's get better. Right? Because I know, are you a good writer? And so sometimes people will come to this kind of conclusion. They're like, actually, no, I'm not a good writer, but I have written well in the past. And that's even healthier. Like you can't be a good writer or a bad writer. Like the truth is that I am capable of writing well. And the neat thing is once you adopt that attitude, it's like, okay, how do I get there again? What did I do when I was writing for the LA Times? How can I get better at this? And so this all moves towards an action orientation, a growth mindset. We've sort of talked a little bit about that on Wednesday, right? So y'all can watch those VODs and stuff if you want to. And the last thing that I kind of want to point out, and this is why I'm sort of bringing up karma, is that now this person is in a situation where, let's assume for a moment, they're capable of writing well. Right? And so if people are not hiring you, does that mean I am bad? So I want y'all to think about this for a second. Let's say I am a gardener, okay? And I'm really good at gardening. I'm a skilled gardener. And then what I have over here is very fertile soil, right? So a lot of good soil. And then what I have over here is a barren desert. Feeling Minecraftish today with rocks. Okay? So let's say that these are the two options. My skill at gardening is the same. When I plant seeds over here, they turn into plants. When I plant seeds over here, doesn't matter how many I plant, don't turn into anything. So what does that say about my skill as a gardener? Right? So maybe even I'm really good, I can get a little bit of a plant here. But this is the key thing that we sometimes forget, right? Is that all we're entitled to as human beings are our actions. And our outcomes don't necessarily determine our skill. So if you're like working in an environment where it sounds like this person was at a company until 2017, everyone was laid off, right? So like, let's just think about that for a second. Like, it sounds like the company was doing well, but everyone got laid off. So there may be like industry-wide changes that affected journalism. So I think journalism has been on the struggle bus for a while, right? As an industry. So like this used to be the thing where the New York Times would like have subscriptions to the newspaper. So they had like revenue because people needed to read the newspaper. And along came the internet, and like now things are behind paywalls, and like, people used to have subscriptions, but I don't know how many people have subscriptions to the New York Times anymore. And so with things like the internet and the free availability of information and the transition to advertising and stuff like that, like the whole industry got changed. And so this company went under in 2017. And so then like things changed. So this is where you need to be careful. So now we're going to kind of get to the practical side of things. The first thing is like, so do all this stuff by all means, but then also recognize that just because you're not getting a job doesn't mean that you're bad at what you do, right? This has nothing to do with esteem. There are karmic industry-wide phenomenon that may be happening, which are essentially moving you in this direction as opposed to this direction. Now, if the gardener works over here for a while, is not careful, they will conclude that they are a bad gardener, which may not be correct, right? It may not be fair. Doesn't mean that there aren't things you can work on. So now what we're going to sort of do, so I just want to set that frame because I think this is really, really important, that your value doesn't necessarily have to do with the way that the world treats you. And this is where the person says, like, I can't tell if I'm a talented writer or not, right? So let's kind of just look at that for a second. So let's look over here. So getting cynical and sad, either the job market can't seem to recognize me as a motivated, intelligent candidate, or I'm not nearly as special or accomplished as I thought, right? Like either the world can't see what I have to offer, or I don't have anything to offer, which makes perfect sense, right? It's a very good question. So let's talk a little bit about that. So like when you're emailing, this is what you do all day, every day. What do people look for? Right? So do emails and like submitting resumes and stuff, like, does that look for brilliance? Right? So like when we do paper applications, so let's think a little bit about, it sounds like this person is emailing. So I'm assuming they're applying to online jobs. And what do y'all think an online employer is looking for? Right? So this is where, as a society, as we become more outcome-oriented, which isn't necessarily bad, right? There are advantages and disadvantages. What we've started to do is use proxies for talent or skill. Because we don't have, like, so here's the thing. I'm going to post a job. I'm going to get 2,000 applications. I don't have time to read 2,000 pieces of writing. So what I'm going to do is start to use substitutes, start to use correlates. Which school did you go to? Where have you written in the past? So I'm going to use all these correlates for brilliance. Because when you apply for a job, no one ever, like if I'm applying to be like an engineer, no one asks how much engineering do you know, right? I mean, they may ask in later forms of the interview, but like generally speaking, at the application phase, like no one is like, do you understand engineering? That's not a part of the job interview. It's like, where have you worked before? What was your GPA? Where did you go to school? And we use all of those as proxies for skill. So in this person's case, like let's try to think a little bit about why this person may be running into problems. Okay. New York Times, LA Times, HuffPo. Professional poker player. right? So like imagine you're an employer. Let's compare you to person number 2. Let's say San Antonio Chronicle. Let's say, what's another? Florida Gazette. And let's say HuffPo. Who are you going to hire? Right? It's like, what are you getting here? So this person made it to final round interviews, so I'm also curious a little bit about the numbers game, because this is the other thing to understand about online employers. It's just a numbers game, right? So if I have like 50 applicants for one position, like what is the percentage chance that I get a job offer? It's like raw, it's like 2%, right? I have 50 applicants. But here's the thing. If we look at a list of candidates that go from 50 to 1, it's not like each of these people gets one application, right? The person who's at the top of the list is going to get like 80% invitations, and the person at the bottom of the list is going to get 0%. And so as this person gets a job, then number 49 will have an 80%, and then number 48 will have an 80%. Right? And so he goes out, and then he goes out or she goes out. And so it's not like actually probabilistically even across the spread, because invitations get given to the people at the top of the list. And so the fact that the person has gotten a couple of interviews tells me that this person should keep applying, because like once you get to the interview stage, then you're actually like a good applicant. When people are interviewing you, that means that what you have on your resume is sufficient for us to hire you. Now we're going to try to get a feel for who you are. And this is where the psychology comes back in. Because when you are this, and when you are concerned about this, when this is what's in your head, when this is what's in your head, when this is what's in your head, how strong do you think you interview? Right? So what is the purpose of an interview? We talked about emails for a second. This is something that I don't know that people have kind of explained. So oftentimes interviews are sort of about, they're kind of like skills assessments in a sense. Right? So it's like, it's a skills assessment. Let's see how brilliant you are. But that's not just what interviews are about. Interviews are incredibly limbic. They're incredibly empathic and incredibly like subsurface brain stuff. Right? It's not like consciously. It's like you're going to meet people. You're like, yeah, I liked that guy. All right, yeah, she was super cool. They were really awesome. What is that? What are people picking up? Would that person be fun to work with? So I remember when I was training in residency, like we would have medical students rotate through. So these were audition rotations. So people wanted to do residency, at this hospital. So people would like come and they'd like audition for a month and they'd come and work there. And some of them were like brilliant on paper. And then like you work with them and it's sort of like, I remember asking questions, like my colleagues and I would ask questions to each other. And it's like, would you want to be supervising this person overnight on call? And for some people, despite the fact that they were absolutely brilliant on paper, the answer was absolutely not. This person would be a nightmare to work with. Right? So that's where like, understand that, I know it sounds kind of weird, but like interviews are not just skills assessments. There's some weird emotional limbic kind of stuff going on. And that's where, so people may say like, okay, then am I screwed? And the answer is no, absolutely not. You're not screwed, because all you have to do is like do this stuff, right? You have to start to think through and recognize that actually you bring value to the table. If you can't fake, maybe you can fake one article for the Huffington Post. But if you've written for the LA Times, New York Times, Huffington Post, and had a political newsletter that had 30,000 subscribers, there's something absolutely legitimate to what you bring to the table. And if you cannot access that in an interview, then your chances of interviewing are going to be like lower, right? So you can kind of fake it till you make it. But I think the really awesome thing would be like, if you can really dig down and do the psychological work before you go into the interview and recognize that, oh, like this is actually my situation, that I'm actually a brilliant gardener and that, you know, I had really, really fertile fields before and now it's like kind of barren. Like I struggled for a little bit, right? And that's okay. So this is the kind of thing where I would say, like, even in interviews, like, I don't know what this person says when they ask them, like, you know, what have you been doing for the last 4 years? And they're like, yeah, I tried being a professional poker player. And so then this is where you could sort of say something like, you know, I'd own it. And I'd say something like, you know, so I wrote for the New York Times, Washington Post, et cetera. Like, I really enjoyed that kind of thing. And then I tried doing some freelance writing. But what I really realized is that, like, I love writing collaboratively. Like, I can write, but in terms of what really gets me excited and what allows me to write pieces that are incredibly compelling, that move people, is when I'm working with a team or in some kind of environment that's like better structured, like the New York Times or whatever. You make that up. And what I'm really looking for is that kind of environment, because that's what allows me to write at my highest level. And when you say something like that, like someone's across the other side of the table, it's like, that's pretty good, right? You have to be able to authentically own it. So I don't think you should lie. Everyone's saying just lie. No, don't lie. Like, this is why you do the introspective work, so that you can say something authentically, right? And when you say something authentically, what it's going to access is this weird, like, limbic stuff. And when you can own it, you're like, yeah, I tried some other stuff for a while, but what I really discovered is I truly love writing and I miss writing. And this is actually what I want to do for the rest of my life. And when you can own that, right, that's what you should say. So it's not just lie. What you should do is say whatever you can own through the introspective process. Okay? Right? So there are a couple of other things to just consider before we kind of wrap up. One is, so I would also do a couple of things. One is get feedback. This is really important. So if you're like hitting your head against a wall in terms of applying for a job, are people reviewing your application? Presumably you're a pretty good writer, right? But it can still be useful to have people like take a look at stuff. And maybe this person has already done that, right? So you can also get feedback from prospective employers. You may kind of strike out here, but you can even ask people, hey, so I noticed that y'all went in a different direction. Can you help me understand what the person who got the job, what did they have or what did you like about them more than me, right? So what were y'all looking for that I was sort of lacking that someone else had? And you may not get any answer at all. You may get some vague answer like a cultural fit or things like that. And sometimes hopefully you'll find someone nice who will actually like give you some information, but you don't know until you ask. So you can even try to get feedback from colleagues, things like that. The other thing is when it comes to getting feedback, so if you have written for the LA Times, New York Times, HuffPo, you may know people there, right? So I would ask them and say, hey, I'm trying to get back into writing and like the job market seems super rough. Do you have any advice? This is where also kind of generic things, so networking. So this is where like I think that if you are someone who is brilliant but has some kind of like yellow flag on your resume, right? So I think this person fits this really, really well, where solid right here. This is like, gold star level. And this over here is like kind of a yellow flag. So if you're someone like this is where the emails and the resumes are not going to be your strongest showing, potentially, right? It depends on writing cover letters and things like that. So this is where like I'd really try hard to network. And people may be like, what is networking? We may do some videos about that or something like that soon. But this is where because ultimately what you want to do is develop human relationships, because human relationships are still really, really important in terms of like decision-making and who we hire, right? So this is where I'd consider like joining a professional organization. So people are like, what are the basics of this? Like join a professional organization. I know people sometimes hate this thing, but LinkedIn can be really good. Right? So you like how is your LinkedIn profile? Like what's going on there? And this is where just meet people. And this is where you don't necessarily want to, and so when people are saying, that's why I say join a professional organization, because a professional organization will have events that you go to and you try to learn whatever you need to learn there, and you'll meet people as a result. Because I think the problem is that the email situation is where there's like, it's just 1,000 faceless applicants. So which faceless applicant who has the prettiest face in a pile of people without faces? Right? So that's the competition you've got. And if you're kind of non-traditional, like you want to meet people if you can. Last thing that I'll sort of say is that, if you are running into a brick wall, this is a little bit about feedback as well, but we talked a little bit about getting feedback. So you can also use these connections in terms of networking. So if you know anyone at the LA Times, if you had an editor or something like that, even if it's been a couple of years, they may remember you. So I'd reach out to them, right? So pull on your network. And say, hey, like, you were my editor for 1 or 2 years, or even if you've got relationships, like if from people at school, like you can even email professors and stuff. You kind of ask them like, hey, this is the situation I'm in. What would you recommend? Last thing that we're going to talk about is running into a wall. So we talked about feedback, but I'm just going to give you all kind of a simple example. So let's say that I'm trying to date, and despite many dating apps and a couple of first dates, right? So tons of emails, few interviews, 1,000 emails, 10 interviews, 1,000 dates. 1,000 matches, 10 dates, 0 second dates. So this is why feedback is really important, because like sometimes the problem here is that like you've got body odor. Right? So there may be something going on that you're not aware of, but which is heavily, heavily influencing your outcomes, right? So I'm not trying to be insulting here, but like that's just the best example I can kind of think of, where there may just be something that you're missing. So like you just didn't realize that maybe, you've got some BO. And similarly here, there may be something in this process, either in the way that you interview or the way that you do your resume, like that you just aren't aware of. And it's not your fault. And this is the kind of thing where it's like, okay, just put on deodorant and the problem's fixed. It's not like, BO is just, it's what I thought of. I recognize it's kind of insulting in a sense, but this is the kind of thing where like, having worked with people who have had body odor, having had body odor myself when I was like 13 years old and before I understood deodorant, this is like something that I struggled with, where I was like, oh my God, I didn't realize. Like one of my friends was kind enough and was like, hey man, you stink. I was like, what is that? Because like, I didn't know, right? Like, I hit puberty and like my body started changing and I didn't really realize like that I smelled bad. And so then it's just something you got to learn. Right. And I thank that dude to this day. It's like one of the best pieces of feedback that I've gotten. So there may be some simple mistake you're making, but unless you ask people, like you don't really know. Right. So just to kind of summarize, it's unfortunately very common that people used to be successful and now they're not. So if we look at these people, like the general profile is that they're told from a young age, oftentimes, that they have all these talents and gifts. And sometimes what they do is they hit a wall in terms of like school or college where they never developed study habits. So they like go from straight A's to like C's and then F's and then don't know what to do. But what's just as common or even more common is that we end up with this sort of situation where they're actually successful, right? So they have prestigious accomplishments and things like that. Totally fine. And then something happens where, unfortunately, they move from fertile soil and lots of progress to barren soil, where even though their skill as a writer or gardener is the same, the results that they get start to change. And when the results start to change, they start to lose self-esteem. Because when it comes down to self-esteem, we get our self-esteem from the outside world or inside world. And it's not even self-esteem. Their sense of esteem comes from external accolades. And when you take the external accolades away, your esteem goes with it. So this is where you need the process of sort of discovering self-esteem, right? You never needed to before because the rest of the world told you how awesome you are. So you never needed self-esteem. So how do you do that process? You start by actually deconstructing your old sense of esteem. When I thought I was the hottest shit in the world, where did I derive that sense of value from, right? Where does my value come from? And hopefully through that process, what you'll sort of discover is that the LA Times doesn't make you a good writer, but it's that because you were a good writer that the LA Times picked up your stuff to begin with. So the value is inherent in your work, and it's just the external world that sort of gave you the approval. And once you sort of figure that out, then you can approach things with confidence. And when you go into interviews, the limbic response that limbic means emotional. Limbic system is what governs our emotions. The emotional response people are going to give to you in interviews, if you're confident in yourself, since you've done that work, since you've developed some self-esteem, is going to be very different and allow you to sort of succeed more. A couple of other practical tips, if you're running into trouble sort of moving forward, you can always get feedback, right? Ask people to review your applications, maybe even feedback from employers. You can reach out to old connections and sort of share your situation with them and see if they have any suggestions, see if they know anyone who's looking for a writer, because a personal recommendation goes a long way. You can join professional organizations or do stuff on LinkedIn related to networking. I know people are like, networking. The truth is sometimes it matters. And why is that? It's because if you're sort of a non-traditional applicant, or you've got a yellow flag because you haven't been writing for the last 4 years, the email application is not going to be the best way to showcase who you are and put your best foot forward. So that's why in-person stuff matters more. You need people to look past some of these things in your application to recognize that there's someone really valuable underneath. And that happens in person. Questions? What if there's not somebody valuable behind the CV? That's exactly my point, is that your sense of value is not determined by the CV, right? So this is where, I believe all human beings have value. I think each and every one of you has something to contribute to the world. And I didn't come to that conclusion just because I'm try to be a good person and see the positive. I genuinely think that. So let me make a case for a second. So if we think about the contributions that people come up with, let's talk about innovation, for example. So innovation requires a certain set of experiences to happen, right? So if we think about the Wright brothers, there's a certain constellation of experiences they had that created the opportunity for them to invent the airplane. You can't have the Wright brothers today because the airplane's already been invented. That boat has sailed. And if that's sort of true, what that means is that each and every one of you has a completely unique circumstance, right? You have a completely unique set of experiences, background, the times you live in today, the age you are, what you've done, what you haven't done. Your experiences and the neurons in your brain are capable of creating something that is statistically impossible for someone else to make. Because no one else knows exactly what you know and has lived exactly what you've lived. And when we think about innovation and where understanding and stuff comes from, it's from what we've learned, right? So if I've read these 10 books, I'm able to form these 10 conclusions. If I've read a different 10 books, I will come to different 10 conclusions. And so this is the key thing, and this is what I sort of figured out in my life is my contribution to the world is based on the opportunities that I was given. And the same is true for all y'all as well. And you may think oh, but what can I possibly contribute? All I do is, playing games all day. And I'm someone who failed out of college because I was grinding Diablo 2 and Warcraft 3. And I still found a contribution, and so can you. Right? It's just thinking a little bit about I really do believe this. And this is why even when we kind of talk a little bit about, people who come on stream, each person who comes on stream has a unique perspective. And what we do is share that perspective. And we can all benefit from it, right?